Hey, welcome to Module 1.2, Feasibility and Costs. And after all, when we're talking about a housing project, we do need to talk about the money. As always, we'd like to thank our funders, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, through their support through community-led designs for specialized housing in the North, as well as acknowledging the partnership that makes the certificate possible between Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Together Design Lab, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and WASA Distance Education Centre. This module will guide us through the preliminary budgeting process. And by the end of this module, you should have a better understanding of the following. What is a feasibility analysis? And what is a preliminary cost estimate? More importantly, though, how do you develop a preliminary cost estimate, and why does it matter? How are you going to use it? Part of that is understanding the difference between capital costs, operating costs, and life cycle costs, and understanding how choices at this stage of the project and throughout impact each of these different costs separately. What are the key principles of feasibility analysis? And what are contingency funds? At this point, we're talking about a quite basic idea of what the house is, and we have pretty minimal knowledge of the design and the site that it will go on. And so the kind of costing analysis that we can do is pretty basic and high level. Oftentimes, this is called a Class D estimate or a Level 4 estimate. And it's the most basic or most preliminary cost estimate. And so it's important when we're thinking at this very early stage of putting together what a project could cost, that we know that the margin for error is substantial. And so usually with a Class D or preliminary estimate, we like to think about a 20 or I would even suggest 30% contingency. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the module. But the important thing to remember about that is that the total project, for it to be able to move forward, and we're talking about feasibility, and especially when we're talking about the scope of the project, what we just talked about in Module 1.1, is making sure that if the budget or the number that we're getting at this point, if 30% is added to that, that's still possible for you. So it's important to keep in mind throughout this discussion of preliminary budgeting that we should always be accounting for 30% on top. What is a feasibility analysis? Really, this is about making sure that your project is financially viable, that the vision you're putting together of what this house will be is something that you can afford. And this should be one of the primary inputs for your scoping statement, as I said, that we created in the previous module. If you can't afford what you're describing in that statement, then the project shouldn't move forward, and you should take a step back and describe another house or another project, or find another solution. The best way to perform this analysis, to check whether the project you're trying to undertake is feasible, is to use the most and best information that's available to you. And that information can look like a few different things that will help you to make that analysis. One of the ways we think about this is through precedent analysis. So that's using past built projects to inform what it is you're looking to build. And those can be built projects that were built in your community or in communities that are nearby. And maybe you can get that information from folks at your tribal council or other technical supports that you use, or just through your existing professional network. But there are other ways to develop a preliminary cost analysis. And what I'm suggesting here is that there isn't a single best way to collect and review the information. There's a lot of factors at play here, and you should really try to get and use all of the information that's available to you. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show examples of what different types of information might be. Those can be the precedents that I mentioned before. They can be construction industry cost guides, and those are kind of standards that are produced by industry professionals to show how construction costs are changing over time and in different contexts. And it's also going to be really important to consider your local conditions. In the context we're talking about here, there's a lot of local factors that aren't captured in those cost guides that you're going to need to know to think about the feasibility of a project. But the most important thing to remember with all of this data is that you should be looking for the most accurate, up-to-date information possible to help to inform your decision making. And also that you're always going to need to account for things like inflation, so cost escalation year over year, as well as as I said earlier, the local contextual elements, the things that make building in your community unique and different from building in other places. So what does that look like? What am I talking about when I'm saying using the best information possible? In this example that we have on screen, there's 4 building projects that have taken place in kind of recent years. And this is information maybe that you've gotten through your network and you've been able to take some notes from what other people have done. And what you see in this chart is representative, in my experience, of how this often goes, where you have some information about some projects and others about other projects, and you're not always comparing totally apples to apples. There are differences in the type of building, in the number of units being built, in the type of labor that built the building. But even though all these examples are a little bit different and share different information, your job at this stage is to try to learn from these examples what you can. And what you can learn about them might also depend on the type of project that you're undertaking. For example, if your community is looking at building a project with some panels, like kind of modular construction in that way for the first time, it might be super relevant for you to look at other communities who have used that technology to see how are their costs and how does that compare to what you've been seeing in the past in stick frame construction, if that's what your community is more used to doing. Or, for example, to reference one of the lines we see on screen here, maybe you're building multi-unit this year, whereas in the past you have usually built detached units, and you want to understand what that cost savings might be. It might be relevant, again, to reference the kind of per square foot costs that other communities were seeing in comparison to the per square foot costs that you were seeing. And so when you're looking at precedents like this, you're not always going to be looking for the same information. It's going to depend on the project that you're undertaking and maybe also where you feel like you're lacking information. What is it that you're trying to learn? And really focus in on that. So the importance in using these case study precedents is seeing trends, seeing differences, acknowledging where certain cost savings may have come from. For example, in what we have on screen, you see that freight is listed as one of the columns. And you might see a really outlying cost when you're going through different precedents. And so it's important when you see that to think, what's different? Is it that they had to rely totally on air freight that year, when usually the winter road is an important part of their freight solution? Is it that they relied totally on external labor, when usually they use a mix of labor? It's really important to actually analyze these numbers and not just look through total cost or cost per square foot, but think about what's contributing to those costs and how that could be reflected in the feasibility of your project. As I said, a second piece of information you can look to are cost guides. And what we see on screen is one of the kind of most widely shared cost guide prepared by the Altus Group every year. And this looks at construction costs for many different types of buildings across Canada's urban centers. And these use built projects aggregated to give a kind of average for certain costs. And one of the ways that in our context that we're learning in this class that you might be able to use these is to understand cost escalations or inflations year over year. Because this is an annual report, you might be able to get a sense for trends and how the construction industry is changing. because remote communities aren't listed in the Altus guide, and instead we're looking at southern urban centers, what you may see is not the per square foot number that you're getting, but you might be able to compare the per square foot number you got in past years and see how that has climbed, and understand what the gap is between the number that you're able to achieve and the number that Altus Group is saying is being achieved in urban centers. And that might be able to give you an estimate for what you could achieve this year in your community. Again, this is just another tool to help you put together a preliminary cost estimate. And the last example I want to bring forward is maybe something that you could actually use in combination with the other ones. This example is based on a cost estimate work that NAN and TDL undertook with Gord Wickham Consulting that identifies a number of factors that will have significant impact on the cost of housing in NAN communities. So this is a kind of guide or way of thinking about cost that is tailored to this context. And these are things that you, in your role as project manager, are going to need to know about your community when you're leading a housing project. So the factors that we see in this guide are access to granular material, equipment availability, infrastructure capacity, shipping access, availability of storage facilities, labor force, scale of the project, so the number of units that you're building in this project, labor accommodations, distance to urban centers, market conditions, as well as experience with capital projects. And it's our understanding that each of these factors is going to raise or keep or lower the cost of a construction project, depending on how on your community's modification required to cost, based on your access to that particular factor. And so what you might be able to understand is using a kind of cost guide, a cost estimate, and then knowing that if your community does not have, ready access to granular materials, that's going to increase the cost of the project by a certain factor. And that's where I say you might be able to compare, if you have good information, if there has been regular building in your community's past results against cost guide past results to better reflect a future cost. But if you don't have all that past data, it's going to be important when you're reviewing even a Class D estimate, maybe that has been prepared externally, to make sure that that estimate considers all of these local factors. And I would say often, actually, when you're getting Class D estimates done, they don't consider any of these factors. That they're really, as I said, a Class D estimate is a kind of, it's a kind of very high level estimate, a cost per square foot estimate, that often when they're being prepared for northern communities, in my experience, they don't consider any of these local factors, and so they can really underestimate the cost. And so it's going to be important when you're working with someone preparing costing, both at this Class D stage and moving forward, and we'll talk about costing again as we go through the life cycle of a building project, that you are aware of these local factors and that you're able to bring them forward as being important in the costing. So while I've emphasized already in this discussion that you should be using all of the best information available to you to make sure that the project you're putting forward is feasible, I do want to add a kind of caution or a caveat to that. And that's that at this stage of the project, before it's been funded, before even the kind of total scoping exercise is completed, that you don't really want to be spending too much money at this stage. You really haven't got any money to spend yet. And so you need to be cautious and instead recognize that this research phase, let's call it, or this putting together a preliminary budget estimate, is a great time to rely on your network and to use the resources available to you, or to make kind of professional contacts that can support you in making these decisions, and using the tools you can find around from previous projects, precedents, cost guides, understanding your local factors to be able to get a good estimate. Now, it's for sure that if you had kind of an unlimited budget at this phase, you could get a much better cost estimate. But until we know that the project is really moving forward, I can't advocate on that being a good use of funds. And this graph that I have on screen now, I hope kind of explains some of the concepts that we've worked through so far in this module. And it is one that we're going to return to later in the course as we get deeper into budgeting and start to think more closely about cost control. What you see on the screen is the relationship between cost control, cost certainty, and the course of the project or the stage of construction. At this phase of the project, we're right at the start and we're just putting together a vision for what construction could be. And so as I said in the previous slide, we've spent basically nothing at this point. So you have the greatest control over cost. This is the time in the project where you're able to make decisions that are best able to shape how you're going to use your money. But you also, as I said right at the beginning of the module, have the greatest uncertainty. And so while you have huge amounts of control and should be limiting what you're spending your money on and keeping clear what your objectives are, you do have huge amounts of uncertainty that you need to prepare for and plan for, set money aside for. But returning to Module 1.1 and the scope of the project, what we learn here about budgeting is that the tighter you can draw the scope of the project, the more precise and focused you can be in what your project is taking on, the better you are doing in controlling costs down the road. You're trying to reduce the ability for scope creep, as we mentioned before, or for uncertainty, or for future changes that are going to dramatically impact the budget. So use this opportunity when you have virtually total control over the budget to make things as clear as you can make them and reduce risk down the road. A final note on budgeting at this stage, at this preliminary stage, and this isn't totally related to your preliminary cost estimate, but is maybe something to keep in mind as you're making decisions that are going to impact cost. There are 3 different types of costs that we're showing on screen here: capital costs, operating costs, and life cycle costs. And for the majority of this course, we're going to be talking about capital costs. Those are the one-time upfront costs that have to be spent to build the house. It's the labor, the material costs. It's everything that it takes to get the structure put up and for someone to be ready to move into it. But there are other costs associated with a house. So once someone has moved in, there's the operating and maintenance costs related to keeping the house running day to day, keeping the heating and electricity on, as well as the kind of regular maintenance required to keep the house in good operating condition. And the total of those costs, the sum of the capital costs and the operating and maintenance costs through the life of the house, are the life cycle costs. And it's important when you're thinking about housing to understand that the house is going to be an asset, usually in the context we're talking about, an asset of the First Nation for its entire lifespan. And so while it's important to find low capital cost housing projects, or housing projects that we can build relatively cheaply, we shouldn't do that at the expense of or in jeopardizing the total life cycle of the house. And it's important to prioritize things like energy efficiency, passive heating, durable materials, and other factors that can have a really significant impact on the operation and maintenance of the house, and as a result, on the total life cycle of the house. It's important to make sure that you're getting an asset that is low cost, not just on day one, like in the capital costs, but in the total lifespan of the asset itself. And while unfortunately most funding programs right now only focus on reducing capital costs and driving that capital cost down without a consideration of the life cycle cost, that doesn't mean that you, as the project manager and potentially someone who's going to be involved in the asset management in the long term, can ignore the full cost that will be incurred for this asset over its total lifespan. You need to have a plan for the full cost of the asset, even if the funding application you're filling out or the private funding source you're going to doesn't totally consider that. And that brings us to the end of the preliminary budgeting and feasibility analysis module. I'm hoping that through this module you understand how to do the research to put together a preliminary budget and how to also perform that analysis to make sure that the vision of the house you're putting forward is realistic and possible within the budget that's been allocated to you. And while you're doing that, how to keep in mind the full life cycle of that asset and be making good decisions, not just for the construction phase, but for the full life cycle of that asset.